My name is Cindy Borden, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, where it is our mission to end veteran homelessness. Join us here each week as we use an equity lens to explore how specific demographic characteristics impact an individual's ability to access safe and affordable housing.
We want to take this time to acknowledge and thank the Home Depot Foundation for sponsoring this podcast and for continuing to fund veterans housing throughout the country. For roughly a decade, the Home Depot Foundation has remained committed to supporting the mission and work of NCHV. Their continued partnership means more housing availability for veterans and hopefully one day an end to veteran homelessness. The Home Depot Foundation works to improve the homes and lives of U.S. veterans, train skilled tradespeople to fill the labor gap, and support communities impacted by natural disasters. The Foundation's Veteran Housing Grants Program awards grants to nonprofit organizations for the new construction or rehabilitation of permanent supportive housing for veterans. Since 2011, the Foundation has invested more than $375 million in veteran causes and improved more than 50,000 veteran homes and facilities. The Foundation has pledged to invest $500 million in veteran causes by 2025 and $50 million in training the next generation of skilled tradespeople through the Path to Pro program. We'll be highlighting some of their work as we talk about various affordable housing developments throughout this series. If you're developing projects that support veterans exiting homelessness or would like to learn more about how the Home Depot Foundation is making a difference and continues to serve those who serve, visit homedepotfoundation.org.
Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. The American population is getting older. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be age 65 or older. This graying of America will affect every aspect of society, straining systems from healthcare to housing. Of the approximately 16.5 million veterans in the U.S. today, 8 million, or almost 50%, are age 65 or older. While that percentage is expected to decrease over time, multiple studies suggest that veterans are more likely to suffer from a variety of chronic conditions and have poorer overall health. We also know that prolonged experience of homelessness causes people to age prematurely, as much as 10 to 20 years beyond their chronological age. Given all that, what can we do to provide housing to aging and elderly veterans currently experiencing or at risk of homelessness, while simultaneously preparing for the future? That is what we'll talk about today. In our first interview, Rodney Harrell from AARP will set the stage by discussing the aging of the American population and how this fundamental shift in demographics will force us to rethink everything from the way we build housing to transportation systems as older Americans become a larger part of society. He will describe the 3 primary factors that impact housing for older adults: accessibility, affordability, and location, and how those factors intersect with other demographic characteristics to increase housing barriers for some people. Finally, Rodney will look to the future with suggestions on how to improve the current housing stock, create new housing, and change the way we think about housing. In the second half of the episode, we'll narrow the conversation to focus on aging and elderly veterans specifically. Susan Michael from New Directions for Veterans will talk about how using project-based vouchers, or PBVs, can open up possibilities for serving veterans, including the aging and elderly who may not be eligible for more traditional tenant-based vouchers. She'll also discuss some of the essential features of New Directions projects that focus on aging veterans and the importance of a holistic approach that incorporates wraparound services and builds a sense of community. We are really excited about this conversation and want to thank Rodney and Susan for sharing their insight and expertise. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Rodney Harrell from AARP here. Rodney, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled that you're here. I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening have heard about AARP and have ideas about what AARP is and what it does. But can you tell us a little bit more about AARP?
Sure. Well, AARP is an organization dedicated to improving the lives of people 50 and older and their families, and really helping people to live their best lives. And we've got millions of members across the country, and a hardworking team that works in many different ways to do just that, to help people make their circumstances better, to help them achieve their goals.
So it sounds like you're saying this is not like my grandfather's AARP, where we think about AARP as being for folks who are older and they get discounts at places. But the extent of the AARP's work is much broader than that, right?
There are discounts too, so I don't want to, of course. But I'm from a group within AARP that works very hard on our social impact and really addressing some of the needs around the country that, frankly, in the current state, make life tougher for millions of folks. And we're really working with some aggressive goals to try to, and vision of the future, to try to make sure that people have better circumstances. And we're going to talk a little bit about housing today, but it spans across many of the issues that impacts people in their lives.
Great. So we hear a lot in the news about the aging of the American population, how it's getting older and what that might mean. But can you dive into that a little bit more? When we say that the population is aging, what does that mean in terms of numbers or trends or things like that?
Sure. The simplest way I like to talk about this is that by the year 2034, we're going to have more people over the age of 65 than under 18, according to the US Census Bureau. And this is the first time in US history that will be the case. At that point, there'll be about 77 million people over 65 and a little bit under that, under 18. And what that means is a fundamental shift of the hundreds of years that have passed. The idea that we have been a country where there were lots of children and young families and the like, and very few older adults, is just not true anymore. I've been at AARP for 15 years, and in that time, it's gone from having to inform city leaders and others that the population's aging and they might want to think about it, to many of them coming to us in the first place, I should say, and really asking, what can we do to support our older population? And that's just one part of society, those city leaders. This aging dynamic fundamentally changes everything. The way we think about housing, the way we build our housing, the way our communities are shaped, our transportation systems, lots of things need to take into account people of all ages, because older adults are a growing part of our society, and it'll be that way.
So we're talking about just a fundamental shift in the way everything happens.
Absolutely. And I think it's a shift and it's an opportunity, right? That I mentioned a few parts of society that may not serve people of all ages well. And so that gives us the opportunity to transform those parts of our society to make sure that we're working for people regardless of their age or physical ability or other factors.
Great. So as you know, this podcast is really focused on the housing sector, and specifically about access to affordable and sustainable housing over time. So what do you think some of the barriers are that aging and elderly adults face connected to that access to affordable housing?
Well, I would break this down in a couple of different ways, in a few different ways, I should say. One is that because of that aforementioned dynamic about the aging society and us not doing enough, only 1% of housing in this country has all of the features that people need to support aging. Things like zero-step doorways, wide entrances, single floor living, bathrooms on the first floor, just the kinds of things that would help you be able to thrive in a home at any age and at any level of ability. Only 1%. Now, it's not all a horror story, because close to half of homes have at least one feature that support aging. So either way, there's a lot that has to happen and improve in the way that we design our housing. The second thing I'll mention is the affordability issue. There are over 10 million households headed by someone who's 65 and older who are paying more than a third of their income on housing. And that's technically called housing cost burden. But the idea is that when you're paying that much for housing, you don't necessarily have the ability to have that cushion that allows you to pay for other things, the health emergency that might happen, or you might need to cut back on transportation or food or some other necessity of life if housing is taking such a large chunk of your income. And the last thing I'll mention in this case is the location of housing. We have a effort called our Livable Communities effort. And the idea there is built around the fact that housing isn't by itself. It's part of, a community, right? That there will be transportation options and community features and services and just all the things around that you might want to be able to walk to or drive to or take a bus to, the grocery stores and the parks and libraries, all those things that we need nearby. And so it's not enough to have housing itself. You need to be able to afford it. You need to be able to thrive in it and move around the home safely. But it should also be located in a place where you can access the things that you need and not be isolated and trapped. Because social isolation is a huge issue for us as well. So, that affordability, the accessibility, and the location of housing are three things that all need to improve if we're to have better choices.
So as you were talking, Rodney, I sort of am envisioning almost like a step stool, right? With three prongs underneath or three legs. And if any one of those legs disappears, the stool's going to fall over, right? And so that's sort of the vision that's coming into my head. So as I think about that affordability, accessibility, and location that you mentioned, when we're talking about aging and older adults and the challenges that they face, how do some of those things intersect with some of the other demographic characteristics that the population may have, including, race and ethnicity, or their socioeconomic background, potentially gender identity, those kinds of things? How does that all either maybe make it easier to house those folks or make it more difficult and challenging?
Sure. That's a great question, because it gets to the point that older adults are not one solid monolithic group where everybody's the same. To your very point, diversity in terms of race is certainly, in the older population, is certainly growing and evolving. So the older population is becoming more diverse. And of course, there are people in various categories all over. And we did a study with the Harvard Joint Center a couple of years ago using our livability index. And that's our index that measures how livable these communities are across the country and measure every neighborhood in the country. And what we did with Harvard was we looked at how that differs for different groups in the population. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it's challenging for different groups to access the kinds of things I'm talking about here. African Americans and Latino families, for example, had a much lower chance of being in communities that had some of the opportunities and other amenities that their white counterparts did, for example. And that's the end result, that we see many of these groups in situations that are not as livable as others. Now, part of the reasons for that, well, they're varied. One is that because of my focus on people across the lifespan, I often talk to and think about folks that have been in communities for decades. And if you think about the fact that, for example, we've had the pieces of civil rights legislation happen in the 60s, but those pieces of legislation were put into place to help address the fact that we had communities that were legally segregated for years. And so people may have been living in communities that were shaped during times when it was perfectly legal to separate people by race. And when you look at even some of the maps from the era where there was redlining of communities and funding wasn't available for government-backed mortgages in communities of color, those are many of the same neighborhoods that are lacking amenities today. So imagine if you're somebody who's been living in that community for 40, 50 years before the Fair Housing Act and other pieces of legislation were passed. You might live in a community that doesn't have those things. And by the way, the Fair Housing Amendments Act to expand that to people with disabilities wasn't passed until 1988. So if you were living in a community before 1988, you might be impacted as well. And honestly, the pieces of legislation and the big policy changes aren't just the only story here, because even though these laws may have been passed and many other laws at the state and local levels, that doesn't mean that people aren't facing unequal treatment or unequal options today. Just because you have a housing voucher, for example, doesn't mean you can find someone who will take that voucher, or that you can find a home that has the accessibility features you might need, or in a location that works for you. So there's certainly an uphill battle to climb for many older adults.
Yeah, and when you think about that, like, yes, you might be able to find a unit potentially, but it's not a unit that's adapted to your needs, or as you said, Rodney, maybe it's not close to where your medical appointments are and you have no way to get there and those kinds of things. So it sort of sounds like things are compounding for some of the folks that we're trying to help.
Exactly. And what I always say is that every housing choice that all of us make is a compromise. My research is based around the idea that there are many components that all of us look for. And, it's hard to find, for any of us to find a perfect house in a perfect neighborhood that's inexpensive and has all the features you need. But to your very point, the more things we have to trade off, the more difficult life becomes. I like to say that older adults are amazingly adaptable, and I've seen people live in a wide range of circumstances that are not ideal by any stretch. But it doesn't mean that we should be or should be forced to be as adaptable as we are. And the more we do to improve the options that people have, the fewer compromises they'll have to make.
Yeah, and I think what comes to mind when you say that, Rodney, is this idea that just because somebody might be able to make it in a struggle and survive in a particular housing situation doesn't mean that that's what we should be striving for them and for everyone else, right? That we shouldn't, just because they're surviving, we want folks to be able to thrive as they age.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I've seen people who have a home that has too many stairs to get down, so they just don't go up the stairs. And but if the only bathroom is upstairs, they have buckets to relieve themselves in because they just can't make it. Now, they can survive in that home, but that's not the way I think anyone should have to live.
Right, definitely. So as we think about, how we sort of look at this going forward, and when we're trying to figure out either how to develop new housing for the aging population, or maybe adapt existing housing stock to better suit those needs, those accessibility needs that we were talking about, what are some of the things that we need to think about when we're doing this?
Well, if you're asking if we need to make a choice between those two things, I'm going to say we need all of the above. We need to do things that help improve the housing stock we have, and we need to change the way we think about new housing. I mean, we have well over 100 million homes in this country, and so, what can we do to improve those homes? We can, when remodeling, we can make many changes to our homes, whether they're minor to major. We have a home fit guide, for example, that walks people through some of the changes you can make, things as small as removing throw rugs that are trip hazards, to bigger things like changing your lighting, or figuring out ways when you are having a full scale remodel to move things around in the home that might make it safer for you. And really, there's no cost to something like removing a rug, up to things that might cost you tens of thousands of dollars to do. So I think all of us should be thinking ahead about the kinds of changes we can make, and make those in our homes. But on the other hand, we're building new housing in this country every day. And my side note is it's probably not enough new housing, but we're building it. And when we should be keeping concepts like universal design in mind. And universal design is the concept that we should make all things usable for people without special modification or changes. So the idea that someone who has trouble walking or reaching or anything, any issue, would have the same ability as someone who doesn't have that challenge to navigate a home or to use its features. And so when we're building new housing, we should be thinking about this and thinking about our aging population that will benefit from these features and build them into our housing as well. So we've got to do both of those things at one time. There just aren't any silver bullets in making our housing meet our aging needs.
Yeah. And so when you think about, we were talking a little bit about adapting your own housing as you go to make it more reflective of universal design principles, those kinds of things. But in my head, I'm picturing an older adult who maybe is in a community that they've been in for a long time. And maybe it's one of those communities that you mentioned before were impacted by redlining and some of those other things. And so they're in a house or an apartment that is not suitable to their needs, but they don't have the income themselves to make those changes. What are some things that we can think about from a policy standpoint, from a provider standpoint, to help those folks age in place, or as I've heard more recently, the term age in community, so they don't have to go somewhere else?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that has happened in that era that we were talking about earlier is the idea that zoning and other policies limited housing choices. And so one of the biggest things that we can do in expanding choices is enact policies that help to counter that. So one of the policies I'm really big on these days is called the accessory dwelling unit. And that's the idea of taking a single family housing lot, and there's already a home on the lot, but adding another unit of housing. I mean, an in-law suite, guest houses, all those things fall into this category, English basements and the like. But the idea is that when we do that, places that may have had restrictive zoning that said that only one house could be on an acre, or that really limited the amount of housing choices in a neighborhood, can create more choices by doing this. The other thing by having these additional housing units is that it also creates an ability for someone in the house, for example, for a house that may have too many stairs, or some of the issues we've talked about. I've seen cases where they built an accessory dwelling unit that was universally designed in their backyard and then rented out the main house, or used it for another family member who moved in, and vice versa. Especially in COVID, as we've seen so many families think about how their loved ones were in nursing homes and wondering what options they could have to help people stay in the homes with them. I've seen folks building accessory dwelling units in their backyard or attached to their home so that an older relative could live with them. And so they then could have that space themselves. So I really like adding that flexibility back in. And while I'm on that topic of how our neighborhoods are shaped, there's a whole movement called missing middle housing. And the idea being that we are building a lot of single family homes in this country. According to our livability index, over 80% of neighborhoods are single family housing only in this country. And that limits choices as well. And so the idea of missing middle housing is whatever happened to the duplexes and triplexes and courtyard apartments and some of these other options that we used to build, that we no longer build in communities. And so again, opening up the way we build this housing is crucially important. And that really tackles the fact that we've limited zoning over the years. And on the separate side, I'll just quickly mention that we can't lose sight of the fact that we just simply don't have enough housing. So we need to build more housing in general, and that housing is very expensive. So there's many different programs to try to maintain and even expand the amount of subsidized housing that we have so that people at all income levels can get the housing that they need. So again, I could go on, but the idea is that there aren't any silver bullets. We have to take a lot to do. And some of that's policy work, and some of that, if you heard me mention the accessory dwelling unit option, some of that we can do ourselves too to help create more housing in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're talking about, Rodney, is more choice, but also more affordable options, just more options in general, through zoning changes. Are there other things that we can do, that we can start thinking about collectively to do to, as we get to that point where the over 65s are more than the under 18s, what else should we be thinking about doing at this point?
Well, as individuals, the simplest thing we can do is to start thinking ahead, not just to think about where we are. One disability rights advocate used to always talk about how we have the Peter Pan syndrome, the idea that we would never grow old. And so people just often, I should say, take the position that, well, I hear where I am and I'll build something to that point. But what happens is life happens, right? And so your circumstances change. Your spouse may pass and your income may drop. So can you afford this continually? You may have some physical change that happens. Can you live in the house? All those things can happen to us. And the people that really, I think, make out better in the end are the ones that think ahead, the planners who at least consider the future as they're making housing decisions and how will this thing serve me over time. But I'll give one personal example of even my own parents who looked at remodeling their home in order to allow one of their parents to visit or perhaps even stay there. So doing things like building a landscape ramp to get rid of some of the steps and just a whole bunch of other features were done. But then my father had a stroke unexpectedly 10 years later. And so the idea that he had planned ahead meant that we now had many of the features in the house that allowed him to stay and thrive there. And so I always use that example as one of, the fact that thinking ahead allows us to sometimes prepare for the thing that we don't expect to happen. And frankly, for policymakers, they just need to know what's going on and know what's happening. And we need to have policies that expand the amount of housing we have, that make sure that housing has the accessibility features we're talking about, and that we don't just ignore the fact that housing exists as part of a community and a neighborhood, that we think about where that housing is located. And there's a range of policy actions we can take to make sure that happens.
Well, Rodney, I just want to thank you for the conversation. There's so many things that have come up today that connect to the other things we've been talking about in the series. Are there any last words that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Well, I just want to share that, but first, thank you for having this conversation. I think it's an important one. And I want listeners to take away that while America's changing, there are things we can do about it, both as individuals and as policymakers and as a community. And so we have a lot at aarp.org/livable on just many of these issues I've mentioned and many more. But I just want us to think about our communities, the complexity of our communities, and make the actions that really expand the choices that we have. That's something we all can do.
Well, thank you again, Rodney. You've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I think our listeners as well. So thank you again for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rodney, for providing a solid foundation on the aging of America and highlighting the complexity of the housing issues affecting older Americans. Our next interview will explore how one organization develops and operates housing for aging and elderly veterans in Los Angeles. We'll hear about the challenges of housing elderly veterans in one of the most difficult housing markets in the country, and how the process is even more complicated for veterans who are not eligible for VA healthcare. Let's hear what Susan has to say. All right. Well, welcome back to the Road Home podcast. My guest today is Susan Michael from New Direction for Veterans. Susan, can you tell me a little bit about New Directions, and then your role in the organization.
Sure. Good morning. So New Directions is a really diverse agency. We dedicate, our mission is to help veterans get back on their feet and improve their lives. We right now offer transitional housing. We do permanent supportive housing. We provide mental health, including a neurofeedback clinic. We also have a women's program, for a transitional program for women who are experiencing homelessness, and lots of clinical services for our veterans that are in transition.
And where's New Directions based?
So we are in Los Angeles. Our flagship office is at the West LA VA campus in Los Angeles, and we have permanent supportive housing throughout Los Angeles and one in Orange County.
Great, thank you. So my understanding is that New Directions developments use a lot of project-based vouchers, or PBVs as they're known, instead of the more traditional tenant-based voucher. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes project-based vouchers unique, and what maybe some of the benefits and the challenges that PBVs pose to, a developer, a resident, and a service provider?
Yeah, our housing portfolio is mixed with both project-based and we offer VASH housing for veterans who have the VASH voucher. Project-based voucher is unique in that it is tied to the unit. And for many of our veterans who do not qualify for other types of voucher, this is it's an optimal housing solution to get them in a unit. And also we are able, because we offer permanent supportive housing, we're able to provide the wraparound services often needed to have them retain their housing. So it's a great opportunity for them.
So are there any challenges to using a project-based voucher approach instead of a tenant-based approach?
Right. So I think that one of the big challenges is that there are requirements that are, set forth based on the voucher itself. And so some of our veterans don't meet those requirements.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about, I know a lot of New Directions developments focus on specific populations or subpopulations of veterans. And so for just a minute, Susan, I'd like to focus a little bit on the aging and elderly population. We hear a lot today in the news that the American population overall is getting older, but specifically that the veteran population is getting older. And so what do you think are some of the biggest challenges or concerns about making sure that those aging and elderly veterans have access to that affordable and sustainable housing as they age?
Yeah, housing has just become so unattainable, certainly in Los Angeles County, as I'm sure that you know. It's very difficult. And so for our veterans that are aging, from what I understand, we have over 18 million veterans that are over the age of 65. And as such, many of them have various physical health challenges in their later years, certainly economic challenges if they are on subsidies for their income.
So certainly fixed incomes, physical challenges.
Yes.
As you think about that, the ability to age in place, or recently I heard the term age in community. And as you're developing some of these projects that are targeted for this age group, how do you plan for, what happens? They may start with some of these issues, but those issues get worse as they age. And so as their capacity, either their mental capacity or their physical capacity, declines over time and their service needs increase, how can you plan for that?
Yeah, it is really challenging. We do have, so all of our permanent supportive housing, including the ones that are focused on seniors, we really do try to build a sense of community within the property itself. So we do have services on site to help them with their needs. We don't provide medical services, but we make the medical services very accessible to them. So whether it's VA healthcare that they receive or another community provider, we offer transportation to and from doctor's appointments. We try to link them to community resources within those neighborhoods so that their access is not limited. Um, and as they age, we many of our veterans unfortunately do pass while they are in permanent supportive housing. But some of them also, transition back to family, or a higher level of care. So sometimes it does happen where they're just unable to continue living on their own. We do have several properties that have larger units, like we have 1 and 2 bedrooms, some 3-bedroom units. So if they needed a care provider to live with them, they could, access that way and stay housed on the property. So there's lots of variation and nuances that we try to take into consideration. Building ADA units, should they need a wheelchair or walker, things like that, to help accommodate.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like a variety of different approaches from making sure everything is ADA compliant, but also having the ability to potentially flex into a larger unit if there was a caretaker involved and those kinds of things. You mentioned, Susan, making sure they have access to healthcare, whether it's VA healthcare or another provider. I want to talk for just a minute about those folks that are not eligible for VA healthcare, those older veterans. And when you compare the non-VA eligible older veterans to the VA eligible ones, do you see any differences between those two populations that may impact their ability to access housing and stay in housing?
The biggest difference that I see is really just the continuity of care and the coordination of care. When we can coordinate care for a veteran who is VA healthcare eligible, all of the service providers can be connected through a social worker or through a healthcare team that communicates and has access to the records of other providers. So any doctor that they would see would be able to see everything that's happening with that veteran in terms of their physical or mental health. When somebody is not healthcare eligible, it makes it very challenging if they have to utilize several different resources throughout the community to get those needs met, especially when there are physical ailments as well as mental health issues. A lot of times there's just a lack of communication. And so oftentimes healthcare needs go unmet because of that.
And so I guess two things come to mind for that. One is if healthcare needs are unmet, does that mean that sometimes acuity is higher in that population? And then my second question is, how does New Directions deal with those issues?
That's a great question. So many of our veterans at this point in time, because we are now continuing to house chronically homeless veterans, they come to us oftentimes with a very high acuity for their mental health issues, and have had a long history of, in and out of hospitalizations and emergency rooms and things like that. And so we really try with our service delivery plans to come up with a way to mitigate some of those issues, whether they're VA healthcare connected or not. We really try to focus on stabilization so that they can sustain housing once they're there. If they come to us and there's some instability, which we expect and can mitigate, our staff who are on site are very well versed in assessing for those. We have partnerships with Department of Mental Health, with Department of Health Services, to be able to provide intensive case management services for them, so that not only can they get housed, get their healthcare needs met, but also be able to sustain the housing and, not go back out onto the streets.
So it sounds like what you're saying is it's really a holistic approach to sort of meeting a comprehensive, comprehensive needs for the veteran, whether they're VA healthcare eligible or not, really trying to see what all of their needs are so that they can get into the housing and then stay in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't just, give them a set of keys and send them on their way. It's really very holistic and ongoing. Many of our veterans, we have a 96% retention rate in our permanent housing, which I'm really proud of. Our workers who are on site work tirelessly every day to create those kinds of communities where people feel a part of, they want to be there and participate in the activities, which I think just overall, our goal is to have our veterans kind of looking out for each other because they care and they realize when somebody's missing from an event and things like that. So, we really strive to perfect that.
Yeah, 96%. That's fantastic. And
yeah,
it just in you saying that it's really does sound like a community, and that some of that addresses what we hear a lot about for older veterans is the isolation. What we hear a lot is that older veterans really suffer from that social isolation, and that can really complicate both physical and mental health issues. And so that sense of community sounds like it's a really important thing.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So we've been talking a little bit about this aging veteran population and some of the developments and some of the work that New Directions does. I'm curious though, how do you decide when to do a new project that's based on this population? What goes into that decision? What are some of the considerations that come into play?
Yeah. So my boss works with our project manager who, my boss is Leo Quadrado, and he's the executive director for New Directions. And he works with many of our partners. We have sustained partnerships with developers and property management companies. And so whenever there's an opportunity, everyone is at the table trying to decide what the guidelines are for the new projects. And so they're the ones that really come up with that creation. It also depends on what funding is available for the project. And so, in certain areas of Los Angeles, there's a need. And so we try to be at the table to fill the gaps. And if there is a need for senior housing, or if there's a need for family housing, then, that's sort of, I think, how the decision gets made.
So Susan, we've talked about a whole bunch of things today, but I'm curious if you have any either last words of advice for other providers or developers, or just things that you hope people will take away from all of this conversation.
Yeah. This is really hard work. Our service providers are amazing, and they really do go the extra mile for our individuals and our families who live on our sites. But I think, certainly as a clinical supervisor, my advice to them is always, to make sure that they're taking care of themselves. And so please, that's always my advice to all of them, is to just really make sure that when you do go the extra mile and you give so much for, people who have special needs, it's really important that you're taken care of as well. And so put yourself first and get enough sleep and hydrate and do all the things that, you need to do to make sure that you're there for them. And thank you for the work that you do, because it's not easy.
Yeah, I think that's a great ending idea, is put the oxygen mask on yourself first.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Susan, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot of great information. Thank you, Rodney and Susan. I'd like to take a minute to highlight a few key points. The three components of housing for the aging and elderly, accessibility, affordability, and location, are interrelated and equally important. Any one component in isolation does not solve the housing crisis. For older African Americans and Latinos, access to livable communities, those that provide opportunities and amenities, is further complicated by decades of segregation, discrimination, and underinvestment. Collectively and individually, we need to change how we think about housing. That includes remodeling or retrofitting existing housing to meet accessibility needs and building new housing that incorporates the principles of universal design and provides choice. Aging and elderly veterans often have complicated mental and physical health concerns that require a holistic approach to housing and supportive services. Creating a community where veterans feel connected and engaged can mitigate the social isolation often felt by older veterans and improve housing stability and quality of life. And finally, as we move forward, we must strive for communities and housing where older veterans don't just survive, but they thrive. You can learn more about the topics we discussed in this episode by checking out the weekly one-pager, which will include links to AARP's Livable Communities Initiative and New Directions for Veterans. Thank you.